I'd like to warmly welcome you to one of the most famous stories in British history. The sort of story that if Steven Spielberg got his teeth into it, he would have a Hollywood blockbuster. We are in Pendle Witch country. The Pendle Witch story is a bit like if you look at, shall I say, a football field. All the positions are very, very near to each other. Newchurch, Roughly, Barley, Blacko, Downham. They're all very close together. Now, in 1612, those areas would be surrounded by a huge forest known simply as the Forest of Pendle. It was isolated. It was away from society. The people living there would have literally lived off the land. The vast majority of them couldn't read or write. There's no doctors, there's no surgeries, there's no supermarkets. It's a tough existence. Also, at that period of time, we had a king on the throne of England who had just taken over from Queen Elizabeth I. Some historians believe she was our finest ever monarch. This person was called King James VI of Scotland, who then became King James I of England. Now, the king was an ardent Protestant and hated the Catholics with a vengeance. The area we're now in was predominantly Catholic. The Townley family from Burnley, landowners, Catholic. The Shireburns, Ribble Valley, Catholic. The south was of Samlesbury Hall, Catholic. So the king had his suspicion on this area. He had written a book called Demonology, which showed his views on Catholicism and witchcraft, which he believed were allied. He believed witchcraft and the fact his wife, Anne of Denmark, couldn't get from Denmark to Scotland to marry him. He also blamed Catholicism and witchcraft for the gunpowder plot of 1605. So he had his suspicions on this area. He gave orders to every one of his magistrates to watch out for illegal Catholic gatherings. Caught up in all of this hysteria were a group of people that were going to go down in history as the Pendle Witches, a most amazing story. So let's turn the clock back now to 1612. We shall enter the Forest of Pendle. Living in the forest in a small cottage is a very, very elderly woman known simply as Demdike. Her real name is Elizabeth Southern. She had lost her husband. She had a daughter called Elizabeth Device. She had 3 children, James, Alison, Jeanette Device, and they lived at Malkin Tower. It sounds great, doesn't it, really? But Malkin Tower would have been a hovel, a real hovel, a one-stone, limestone room. Living nearby was an enemy of Demdike, known simply as Anne Whittle, commonly known as Bessie Chattox. She lived in Newchurch in Pendle with her daughter Anne Redfern. These two families were not friends. Many historians believe that they were both involved in herbal treatments. They were certainly over 85. They'd somehow defied the laws of nature. Life expectancy in those days, if you were lucky, would be 35. These two women were doing extremely well. It's said that Anne Whittle broke into Malkin Tower one day and stole items of clothing, hat and a bag of meal. There was no love between these two families whatsoever. In the winter months they'd have no option but to beg off travellers, but it's believed in the summer months they did in fact make herbal remedies for sale. So our story starts on a bitterly cold March day way back in 1612, the 18th of March, when Alison Device left Malkin Tower, had a walk along the length of Pendle Hill and made her way towards the town of Colne nearby. As she entered the Colne Road on the way to Trawden, she came across a Halifax peddler called John Law. When I say peddler, John Law was basically a walking salesman, large pack in his back, full of 1612 luxuries. Alison would be dressed in rags, she'd be starving. "Oh, please, sir, you can spare a few pins, sir." "Get away with you. I'm not taking me back off for you, lass. You got no money. You're no use to me." "Oh, please, sir, you can spare just a few pins to pin me clothing together, sir." According to John Law, the Halifax peddler, out of the bracken, out of the hedgerow on the Colne to Trawden Road, appeared a huge black dog with snarling white teeth and glowing red eyes. The dog sat next to Alison. The dog turned to look at Alison, and the dog said, "What would you like me to do with him, Alison? I can lame him." "Lame him!" she screamed. Law felt this terrible pain in his left arm, his left leg, left instead of his face, and collapsed on the Combe to Trawden road in agony. He lay there for a good 5 hours, writhing in agony. The kind people of Combe could see him. They got a stretch team together and they carried him down to an old inn in Combe, which is long since gone, apparently called the Greyhound. There the landlord, Jonathan Edrington, spoon-fed him. He cleaned him. As Law's voice returned some 5 days later, Law shouted, "I've been cursed! There's a witch in the forest, a young lass with a dog, I swear to you. I heard the dog talk, she's a league devil. Send letters back to my family. Tell them what's happened to me." Edrington wrote a series of letters back to Halifax. John Law, the Halifax peddler's eldest son, Abraham, received the first letter. Me father's in trouble. I better go and collect him." He set off from Halifax, arrived in Combe, saw his father in this twisted and contorted state. "Father, what's happened to you, man? You look terrible." "Abraham, I've been cursed. I met a young lass in the forest of Pendle. She's a witch. I tell you, she's got a dog. I tell you, the dog talks. She's in league with devil. I want you, lad, to go and find her. Bring her here, reverse the curse." Abraham must have been a very brave lad. He set off and walked up the slopes of Pendle Hill through the twisting pathways through the forest of Pendle, almost like a Hansel and Gretel situation. He came to this stone cottage in the clearing called Malkin Tower, hammered on the door. The door opened, and there was James Devise, Alison's brother. "Can I help you, sir?" "I want to see Alison Devise." "Where is she?" "She's in here, sir." Alison came to the door. "Can I help you, sir?" "You've cursed me, father. He wants to see you." "Oh, no, sir, I did nothing like that." "You're coming with me." Against her will, she was dragged out of Malkin Tower, through the twisting pathways, down into the town of Combe, where she made her way into the Greyhound Inn and made eye contact with John Law, the Halifax peddler. Law looked up from his sickbed. "It's you, York witch! You cursed me, that dog you had. I heard it talk, you league with devil, aren't you?" This 14-year-old girl, on bended knees, burst into tears and begged forgiveness. She had no idea. She'd just confessed to a state capital offence of witchcraft. And strangely enough, John Law, the Halifax peddler, was about to forgive her, and the whole story would have disappeared. But not his son Abraham. Oh no, we'll have you for this. I'm going to go and get magistrate." And in doing so, he opened the 1612 Pendle Witch Trials. Now, the local magistrate was called Roger Nowell. He lived in the village of Reed, near Barley, not too far from where we are now. He had his book of demonology. He was fully aware of the king's paranoia relating to witchcraft. He also knew if he could incriminate this young girl, he was going to curry favour with the King of England personally. Therefore, orders were given from the sheriffs of the forest to arrest young Alison. She was brought to Reed Hall, Burnley, where for the second time inside 24 hours she burst into tears and begged forgiveness. But she gave Roger Nowell a lot more information. "My grandmother Demdike, she's a witch. So's Betty Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern. We are familiars." "Familiars?" said Roger Nowell. "Yes, sir. Dogs. Tib, Ball, Fancy, Dandy. These dogs, sir, came to us at different times of our lives. And they talked to us, sir. They said, 'Look, we can give you special powers, but in return, we need to suckle from your flesh, take your souls. We also make clay pictures, sir.'" "Clay pictures?" said Roger Nowell. "Yes, sir, dolls, but with human hair and human teeth. We have had teeth from Newchurch Cemetery, sir, and hair as well, sir. We make these clay pictures on the orders of the dogs, sir. They tell us to select certain victims. We then crumble the clay picture on the fire, sir, and people die, sir." Strange enough, Roger Nowell wasn't scared. Apparently, he was delighted. He had a confession and gave orders that Demdike, Chattox and Redfern should also be arrested. He made his way to a place called Fence, again not too far from where we are now, where he interviewed all three of them. There they were also brought to Reed Hall, Burnley, where they met young Alison, and this huge argument erupted. Remember, There's no love between Demdike and Chattox, in fact, a hatred. Chattox blamed Demdike blamed Chattox. Alison was convinced that she had laid John Law, the Halifax peddler, and Anne Redfern was very, very confused, but in doing so, the blame went round the table twice and came back twice, and all four of them unwittingly admitted to witchcraft by blaming the next person to them. They made the long journey from the beautiful forest of Pendle over what we call the Trough of Bowland and into the city of Lancaster, where they are thrown into Lancaster City Castle, into what we call the Well Tower. It's a deep, deep underground dungeon. As you walk down the steps, the light behind you fades. They are chained to the floor in appalling conditions, and there they are going to wait for 4 very long months. In the meantime, here in the forest of Pendle, at the little cottage called Malkin Tower, Elizabeth Devise is very worried about her mother Demdike. She's very worried about her daughter Alison, and she organises on Good Friday 1612 here in the forest of Pendle at Malkin Tower what has gone down in history as the Good Friday meeting, where all these other so-called witches met. A scene a bit like a Shakespeare play, really, as Alison's brother James slaughtered sheep from the fell. They dined on fresh mutton. They apparently got a cooking vessel called a cauldron, lit a fire beneath the cauldron, and the black syrupy liquid began to bubble and steam, and into that black bubbling liquid went crushed, powdered human teeth, the odd clay picture, and we are told the odd human scalp. The whole idea, apparently, was to get a potion together to blow the gates of Lancaster City Castle open and rescue their loved ones. However, nothing happened. What did happen is word of Roger Nowell, the local magistrate, and he gave orders that every single person who'd attended the Good Friday meeting should be arrested immediately. When word filtered into the forest of Pendle, 2 people thought, there's no way we are going to hang around. Christopher Howgate and his wife Barbara. They disappeared into the West Riding of Yorkshire, and in doing so they saved their lives. We do know the people who were successfully arrested were Jeanette Preston of Gisborne, West Yorkshire, Catherine Hewitt, Alice Gray of Combe, Elizabeth Devise, James Devise, Jeanette Devise of Malkin Tower, John and Jane Bulcock, a mother and son from Blacko, the actual area we're in now, and the real star of the show, a lady called Alice Nutter of Roughly. They were all sent to Lancaster with the exception of the 2 Jeanettes. Jeanette Preston came from Gisborne, West Yorkshire, so therefore she was dealt with by the York City magistrates. We do know that her husband went with her. We do know that villagers went with her to York to beg for her release. However, she was put on trial, and there the jury found her guilty of attending the Good Friday meeting at Lancashire, but also the murder of her employer, Mr. Thomas Lister. She'd been nursing him. He had died. She wrapped his body in a clean white sheet ready for burial, and 2 days after the burial she touched the sheeting and some fresh blood came for the sheet. This was classed as witchcraft. But remember, life expectancy in those days would be 35 if you were lucky, and she had been nursing him for a good 2 years, apparently. She became the very, very first of the Pendle witches to be executed in the city of York on the 27th of July, 1612, at a place called Whitmar Watmergate, the bottom of the shambles in the city. The other Jeanette, the little girl who lived with the Devise family at Malkin Tower, she apparently, we are told, was sent to live with the local magistrate. She had no idea that she was going to play a pivotal part in the prosecution of her entire family. She was sent to live with Roger Nowell, the local magistrate. There she had 3 meals a day, lovely warm bed to sleep in, and nice clothes to wear. After 3.5 months of this grooming, if you can call it that, she was only too happy to incriminate her whole family. Roger Nowell now has all these people waiting for trial. He writes the King personally. The King is absolutely delighted. Mr. Nowell, sir, I shall send 2 circuit judges, James Altham, Edmund Bromley, a young boy called Thomas Potts. And that's why we're here now, folks, because Potts was going to write a book in 1613 called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in Lancashire, which would later earn him a lot of money. It's the only window we have in this whole story, and you have to rely on that window being honest and truthful. What we do know is Thomas Potts was very, very loyal to the king, extremely loyal, and there's no way he'd want to upset him. The court was assembled in the city of Lancaster. The jury consisted of all males. Women were not allowed to sit in the jury. Young Jeanette Preston was brought in and picked up by Roger Nowell and put on top of a desk. Her mother Elizabeth noticed that she'd put weight on, and as young Jeanette told them about these dogs arriving, Tib, Ball, Fancy, Dandy, and how the dogs had talked, and how the dogs had told people like Chattox, Demdike, Redfern and Alison to curse various people, to fashion clay pictures, her mother shouted, "Stop it, Jeanette, stop it! You don't know what you're saying!" "Have my mother removed from the court, sir. She is upsetting me." As it happened, the court believed every word this little girl said. They found it impossible that a young child should be manipulated, or could be manipulated, to tell nothing but the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Demdike, Elizabeth Southern, defied the court to the very, very, very end. She died before the trials began. However, in her absence, she was found guilty of the murder of Henry Mitten of Roughly, the child of Richard Baldwin, and Mr. Josh Robinson, by fashioning the clay pictures. And of course, her granddaughter, little Jeanette Preston, also brought this up as well. Bessie Chattox was brought into court. She was in a terrible, terrible state of health. She'd been lying in her own waste. She was described by Thomas Potts as a skeleton in rags. Her teeth were chatting away with fear, and they very kindly gave her the name Chattox for this reason. She was found guilty of having a dog called Fancy, which could change from a little boy wearing a brown jacket into a dog that suckled from her flesh and took her soul away, but gave her special powers. She told the court that the dog had told her to make various clay pictures for the murder of Robert Nutter, Anne Nutter, Anne and Hugh Moore, and also John Devise, related to the Devise family. She freely admitted to this, apparently. Her daughter Anne Redfern was then brought in, and Anne Redfern was found guilty of the murder also of Robert Nutter. But apparently, from what we understand from local folklore, Robert Nutter tried to rape her, and she tried to resist this. Again, this is subject to sheer speculation, but there's no smoke without fire. James Devise was brought in, and the jury were quite convinced that he had been tortured. He was in a terrible state of health. He was lapsing in and out of consciousness, and two warders had to stand either side to hold him up. As it happened, he had self-incriminated. He'd actually admitted to witchcraft. He told the courts that you will find these little clay pictures at Malkin Tower, which they were brought in as evidence against them. But he also mentioned how he'd seen these dogs arrive as well. And he was found guilty of the murder of John Duckworth, Hugh and Blaise Hargreaves, and Anne Townley of Townley Hall, Burnley. He freely admitted to witchcraft. Young Alison was brought in, and Alison was convinced that she had indeed lamed John Law, the Halifax peddler. John Law was actually in court that day, and James Altham said, "Is there any way you could reverse the curse of Mr. Law over here?" "Only my grandmother could do that, sir, and she is dead." She freely accepted her fate. Now, this is where the story does take a bit of a twist, really, which is why Mr. Spielberg should be involved, really, because it's almost like a Hollywood thriller. Catherine Hewitt and Alice Gray were brought in. They came from Cone. Catherine Hewitt was known simply as Mould Heels. That was her nickname. She was found guilty of the murder of Anne Foles of Cone by witchcraft, but her friend Alice Gray was actually found innocent of the crimes against her. She was the only person that was going to walk free from the court that day. Now, our next three accused, John and Jane Bulcock, and indeed Alice Nutter. John and Jane were farmers, and they farmed the land outside this very, very window. It has been said, never confirmed or denied, but these stories have been handed down through the centuries. I am actually from Cone. All my family are as well. I remember my grandmother telling me as a young child about this story. about how John and Jane had complained to Roger Noel, the local magistrate, about land disputes on their farm, and he'd done nothing about it. Also, living at Roughly was this rather gracious lady called Alice Nutter. Alice was a widower, but she lived at Roughly Hall. Roughly Hall is still standing to this very, very day. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. Grade 1 listed building. Again, she had problems with her land, with land disputes. Land was shrinking, animals taken, fencing pushed back apparently. And again, it has been said, but never confirmed through Potts's book, that she had complained to Roger Noel again about land disputes and he'd done nothing about it. So therefore, according to the stories relating to her, she made her way to the city of Lancaster and she went over Noel's head to see the senior magistrates, taking her deeds and her maps with her, and she won all her land disputes fairly and squarely. However, as she left Lancaster, along with John and Jane, there was a very, very annoyed Roger Noel. He was furious. He was embarrassed. How dare this woman go over my head? I need revenge. I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He had young Jeanette with him, the little girl. For the second time that day, he picked her up and put her on top of the desk. And James Sir Altham said, Jeanette, these 3 people over here, John and Jane Bulcock, Alice Nutter, were they at your home on Good Friday at the Forest of Pendle at Malkin Tower? They were, sir. A look of shock and horror came across the 3 faces, because they realised on the evidence of this little girl, they were being found guilty of witchcraft. The accusation against John and Jane was that they'd turned a young girl called Jean Mead of Harrogate, West Yorkshire, completely insane by witchcraft. They made pleas of not guilty, but on the evidence of the little girl, they were found guilty of attending the Good Friday meeting, but also the murder by witchcraft of this young girl from West Yorkshire. Alice was found guilty of aiding Demdike and Alison Device in the murder of Henry Mitten of Roughly because he wouldn't give them a penny. Alice made a plea of not guilty of all the offences against her. And when you look at her, she was a wealthy lady. She wouldn't need to beg. But it's very, very likely she wouldn't even know Demdike or Chattox either. She wouldn't even need to meet them, really. But however, on the evidence of this little girl, she was found guilty of witchcraft. Along with another lady who had nothing to do with the Pendle witches, she was called Isabel Roby. And Isabel came from St Helens, a place called Windle, which we now call Merseyside, and she was sent to Lancaster, and there she was found guilty of witchcraft in her own area. But she was going to join them all on the pillory. The Pendle witches were all executed in the city of Lancaster, at a place known simply as the pillory, the gallows, if you will. Long ropes hanging down. They all had their hands tied behind their backs. They had to mount a rostrum. There, the stools were kicked out from underneath them. It has been said, again never confirmed or denied, that as the rope was placed on Alison's neck, she turned and saw this huge crowd gather to watch the execution. She looked down and saw the little girl, Jeanette Device, holding the hand of Roger Noel. And she looked down and shouted, "I shall haunt you for the rest of your life." Then the stools kicked out underneath them. These poor people did not hang, they strangled to death. Watching that day was young Jeanette, apparently. And as soon as she saw her whole family stop twitching, the landowners, the people from Coney, etc., Roger Noel said, "Goodbye." "But sir, surely I'm going back to that lovely warm house of yours, sir." "Goodbye." He'd used her. She made the long journey back to the cold Forest of Pendle, to a cold and empty cottage, knowing full well her evidence had claimed the life of her entire family and all the landowners. We know she lived because 3 years later she was arrested here in the Forest of Pendle. A young boy called Edmund Robinson said he'd been walking through the Forest of Pendle and seen her commit acts of witchcraft. Of course, with her family reputation, this was taken very, very seriously. She was arrested, sent to Lancaster stripped naked, and looked for suckling marks on her body, down to the City of London, examined by practitioners, back up north again, down to London, and after 2.5 years of going up and down the country, this young boy Robinson said, "Actually, I made it all up. I didn't see her do anything." So you could say that witchcraft destroyed that poor girl's life and, of course, her entire family, the superstition surrounding it. However, there were 3 people that day that were exceptionally lucky in terms of not having their necks stretched. They were known simply as the Samlesbury Hall Witches. Who were they? Jane Southworth, Jean and Ellen Barley, 2 twin sisters. They'd been enjoying a meal at Samlesbury Hall when the King's Commission arrived. "In the name of the King, we arrest you for witchcraft." The 3 of them looked at each other. What? Sir Richard Southworth's daughter was being arrested for witchcraft. The 3 of them were shackled, taken to Lancaster, and put in the cell next to the Pendle witches. They never saw the Pendle witches. They may have heard muffling sounds coming from the side of the cell, but they were kept in a different cell. On the 20th of August 1612, Jane heard this huge roar outside her cell. She climbed onto the shoulders of her 2 best friends and looked out the window, and there she saw the Pendle witches standing on the trestles. This huge roar echoed around Lancaster. As the trestles were kicked up underneath them, Jane witnessed the actual execution. Her heart must have accelerated in her chest. Her mouth must have gone dry. She then heard the sound of footsteps that got louder and louder. A key is placed in her door. The door opened, and there's Mr. Thomas Cavell, the head jailer, Lancaster City Castle. "Right, you 3. Just dealt with that lot. Your turn next. Follow me." The 3 of them must have been horrified, particularly Jane, as they made it with the twisting staircase and into the same courts that had just dispatched the Pendle witches: James Altham, Edmund Bromley, Thomas Potts, Roger Noel, William Holden and John Bannister. Again, the same jury, all male, no females. And you can imagine the atmosphere was pretty hectic after what had just happened in the morning. They brought in another child witness, a little girl even younger than Jeanette Device. She was called Gracie Salberts. Gracie was the head gardener's daughter at Samlesbury Hall. Roger Noel, for the second time, picked her up and on top of the desk so the jury could see her. James Altham then said, "Right, young lady, read out your testimony against these 3 witches." "I will, sir. I was walking along the banks of the River Ribble, sir. It was a very hot summer's day, sir. I then saw Jane South and the 2 Barley sisters swimming in the river, sir. It was a hot day, sir. I then saw these unusual dogs. I've never seen the breed before, sir. Long backs, large heads, cloven hooves, sir. They jumped into the river. They materialised into human beings, slightly dark-skinned human beings. They picked up all 3 women. They danced in a circle, paired off for a meal. And then I saw there were fraternisation from a distance, sir, with these demonic spectres. On the second day, Ellen Barley came to see me. She said she was going to change from a woman into a dog, and she did, sir. She chased me. She tried to suffocate me under a blanket of straw, but I escaped, sir. On the second day, the 3 of them came to see me. They said, Gracie, would you like to have a bit of fun?" I said, "Fun? What do you mean by fun?" "Well, a little boy's just been born at Samlesbury Hall called Thomas Walshman to one of the coachmen." "So? He hasn't been christened. We'd like to drink his blood," said the 3 of them. No, said Gracie. "I don't want to get involved in that." James Altham picked the gavel. "We find out." Before the word guilt came out, his companion, Bromley, said, No. Let her finish her testimony." "Sir, in the dead of night, the 3 of them made their way to Samlesbury Hall, sir. They went upstairs to the long gallery where the little boy was sleeping in his cot, sir, in the corner of the long gallery. They picked him up, they pricked his stomach, and over 4 nights they repeated this, sir, and they drank his blood. He was then interned at Samlesbury Church, sir." Again, Altham was going to pick up the gavel. "We find it!" But his companion said, No. Let her finish her testimony." "Sir, in the dead of night, they went back to the cemetery, sir. They dug up the coffin. They took the baby out of the coffin, sir. They boiled the baby's flesh. They kept some ointment from the flesh that would enable them to change shape, sir. And they ate and consumed the baby, sir." That was it. James Altham this time did pick up the gavel. "Right, on this evidence, we find you guilty. You will die like the rest." Before the gavel came down, James Southworth shouted, "Sir, I beg of you, sir, to cross-examine this young girl, sir. She's been manipulated by a Catholic priest called Thompson, hiding at Samlesbury Hall, sir." Just that one word, Catholicism, made them all sit back. "You're an Anglican, you say?" "Yes, sir. I married into the Southworth family, so they've never liked me because of my Anglican views, sir. This young girl's been manipulated by a Catholic priest to incriminate me, sir, and my 2 friends, sir. Please cross-examine her." The word Catholicism echoed around Lancaster City Castle that day. and the two circuit judges, James Altham, Edwin Bromley, Thomas Potts, Roger Noel, William Holt and John Bannister, took everyone out of the courts, including young Gracie. You can imagine Jane South and the two Barley sisters waited. Would they live? Would they die? The trauma, the tension, the stress must have been awesome. The court was reassembled. James Altham took up his position once again and addressed the court. In the light of new evidence, we find you, Jane Southworth, you, Jean and Ellen Barley, innocent of the crimes against you. You're free to go. The three of them hugged each other. They jumped for joy. As they left Lancaster City Castle that day, Jane turned and saw the pillory. She saw the pendle which was hanging and blowing in the wind. At the end of the pillory were 3 empty nooses, and she realised she had not only saved her life, but the life of her 2 friends as well. They went back to Samlesbury Hall for the party of all parties. But the story has not ended there. For hundreds of years, historians have argued between the Pendle witches and the Samlesbury Hall witches. We know from Thomas Potts' book, The Wonderful Discovery, they were indeed tried the same day by exactly the same courts at Lancaster. However, 200 years later, 2 local doctors, Dr. Whittaker, Dr. Dawson, sat round a glowing fire in a beautiful old inn in the village of Warley near Clitheroe, called the Warley Arms. They discussed the Pendle witches and they discussed the Samlesbury Hall witches. That's when Whittaker said to Dawson, "I believe young Grace Salberts was telling the truth." "How?" said his companion. "Well, the way she's described those 3 dogs in the River Ribble, cloven hooves, long backs, large heads, are just like the dogs belonging to Demdike, Chattox and Redfern. Remember, she would not have been in the court that day, so therefore she would not have had access to the files or the information relating to it. But also, let's write to York Minster and get permission to exhume the Walshman grave." They wrote to York, and the City of York dispatched the Reverend John Franks to oversee the exhumation of the Walshman grave under Church of England supervision. They arrived, they got the grave records from Samlesbury, from the Samlesbury Church, and they started to dig. Just 3 feet beneath the surface, in solid clay, they came across a lozenge-shaped 1612 Charles coffin. Under Church of England jurisdiction, it was opened and found to contain absolutely nothing. Who knows? Young Grace may just have been telling us the truth. We shall never, ever know. What I can tell you is if this story was to reach the ears of Mr. Steven Spielberg, you would have a Hollywood thriller of great magnitude, because the whole area is still here. There are still 4 buildings surviving from that period of time: Samlesbury Hall, Lancaster City Castle, Ruffley Hall, home of Alice Nutter, and also the home of Jeanette Preston in Gisborne. I hope and pray that one day you make that film. Thank you very much indeed.